Orpheus and Eurydice, what the underworld teaches us about love, loss, and letting go. Somewhere beneath the world, there is a staircase that has no bottom step you can see from where it starts. It only reveals itself the higher you climb. And on that staircase in the story we are about to tell, a man is climbing with his eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw locked, and his hands shaking at his sides because he has been given exactly one rule, and he is about to break it. His name is Orpheus. You may know him as a musician. What the old stories don't tell you clearly enough is that he was, before anything else, a husband. And 3 days earlier, his wife Eurydice had stepped on a snake in the tall grass at their wedding feast, and by nightfall she was gone. Not sick, not sleeping, gone. The way people are gone when there is no more air moving through them. Most men in his position would have buried her. Most men would have grieved in the ordinary way, the slow, exhausting way, the way that takes years and doesn't ask your permission about the timeline. Orpheus did not do the ordinary thing. He picked up his lyre, the instrument he had played since he was a boy, the one that could reportedly make rivers pause and stones weep, and he walked to the entrance of the underworld. And he played. He played for the ferryman, Charon, until the old man's oars stopped moving out of something like wonder. He played for the 3-headed dog who guards the gate, until all 3 heads went slack with sleep. He played finally in front of the thrones of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead, and he did not ask. He didn't plead, not exactly. He played them the sound of what it feels like to lose someone before you were ready. And it is said that Persephone, who herself had once been taken from the world above and knew something about being pulled into darkness against her will, wept. It is said that Hades, who never grants anything, granted this. And here's the condition, and you need to sit with it for a second, because everything that happens next depends on how well you understand this single sentence. Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the world of the living on one rule. He was not allowed to look back at her until they had both fully reached the surface. Not once, not to check, not to make sure. He had to walk the entire climb through the dark, through the narrow places, up out of the underworld and into daylight, trusting that she was behind him without ever turning to confirm it. Think about what that actually requires of a person. You've just gotten the one thing you wanted, more than anything else in the world back. The person you thought you'd lost forever is right there, close enough that if you reached back your hand, you might touch her shoulder, and you are told, don't look, just walk, just trust. This is not a story about magic. It is not a story about music powerful enough to move the dead. It is not a story about a happy ending. It is a story about the one thing love asks of us that we are worst at giving. Trust without proof. Stay with me here because right now, in this frozen second, we're going to keep coming back to across the next few hours. Orpheus is almost there. He can see a thin grey line ahead of him that is not the colour of the underworld. It's daylight. Real daylight, the kind that falls on grass and water and skin. He is so close. He can almost feel the temperature of the air start to change. And behind him, he thinks he can hear something, a footstep, a breath, or maybe he can't hear anything at all. And that is exactly the problem, because for the last mile of this climb, the silence behind him has grown so total that his mind has started filling it in with fear. You know this feeling, even if you've never walked out of the underworld. You know it if you've ever sent someone a message and watched the little dots appear and disappear 3 times without a reply. You know it if you've ever lain awake at 2 in the morning convinced, with no evidence at all, that the person sleeping next to you has already, quietly, in some part of themselves you can't see, started to leave. The specific flavor of terror that comes from loving someone you cannot currently see or hear or touch, having to just believe his hand is beginning to turn. Not his whole body yet, just his head an inch. testing the idea the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. We are going to leave him exactly there, at the edge of the worst decision of his life, and we are going to come back to it. Because before we find out what he does, you need to understand something about why he's about to do it. You need to understand what it is inside a person that makes silence, more than almost anything else, feel like proof of loss. Because here's the part most couples miss when they hear this story as children and file it away as a myth about music and monsters. This isn't an ancient problem. It's the oldest one there is, and it is still, right now, playing out in kitchens and cars and quiet bedrooms all over the world. A wife lying awake wondering if her husband still wants her the way he used to. A husband checking his phone for the 4th time in an hour because his partner hasn't texted back. A grown son standing at his father's hospital bed, 3 words caught in his throat for 40 years, terrified that if he says them now, it will somehow mean it's too late. All of them are climbing the same staircase. All of them are being asked to trust something they cannot currently see. Some of them will make it to daylight without looking back. And some of them, like the man we just left frozen on the stairs, his head starting to turn, will not. We're going to spend the next few hours with both kinds. We're going to meet a husband named David, whose wife is recovering from something that nearly took her, and who has been told by every doctor in the room that the worst thing he could possibly do right now is rush her, doubt her, or need her to reassure him. We're going to meet a man named Frank, who found a letter in his dead wife's handwriting and couldn't bring himself to open it for 3 weeks. We're going to talk about what psychologists now understand about why some of us reach for reassurance the moment love goes quiet, and why some of us pull away the second it gets close, and what the difference actually costs a relationship over 20, 30, 50 years. And at the very end, when we come back to that staircase, when we finally find out whether Orpheus turns his head all the way around, and what it costs him if he does, we're going to ask you the only question that has ever mattered in a story like this one. When you love someone you cannot currently see, cannot currently hear, cannot currently touch, what do you do with the silence? Do you fill it with fear, or do you fill it with trust and keep climbing? Let's start at the beginning. Not the underworld, the much smaller, much more ordinary underworld that a man named David walked into 18 months ago in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. The first time a doctor said the word if instead of when. David had never been a man who prayed. He wasn't against it exactly. He just hadn't needed to. Not in 44 years of an unremarkable, comfortable life. And then on a Tuesday in March, his wife Elena collapsed in the kitchen while reaching for a mug on the top shelf. And by the time the ambulance reached the hospital, David found himself in a plastic chair in a hallway praying to something he couldn't name, bargaining with a version of the universe he'd never bothered to believe in before. The diagnosis, when it came, was the kind that rearranges a person's whole sense of time. Not fatal, not necessarily, but long. Neurological condition that would require months, maybe longer, of careful patient recovery, physical therapy, cognitive rest, and something the doctors kept repeating, gently but firmly, in a way that David didn't fully understand until much later. Her healing depended almost as much on her emotional environment as it did on medicine. She needs to feel safe. One doctor told him in a small consultation room, with the box of tissues, that nobody in that room was pretending was decorative. Not managed, not monitored, safe. If she feels like she's being watched, like she has to perform being okay for your sake, or reassure you every hour that she's still in there, it will actually slow things down. Nervous system doesn't heal well under surveillance, even loving surveillance. David nodded like he understood. He did not yet understand. What surprises most couples about a moment like this is this. Everybody assumes the hard part is the diagnosis itself. The scan, the waiting room, the word nobody wants to hear. But for David, the diagnosis wasn't actually the hardest part. The hardest part came 6 weeks later, a quiet stretch of an ordinary Thursday evening when Elena was sitting on the couch, reading, present and breathing, and technically fine. And David felt a wave of fear so sharp it nearly knocked the wind out of him because she hadn't said anything in 20 minutes. And some old animal part of his brain had started to whisper that the silence meant something was wrong. He didn't know it yet, but he had just met the exact same staircase Orpheus was standing on. He just didn't have music to help him climb it. And to understand why that quiet Thursday evening hit David as hard as it did, it helps to go back further to the David who existed before any of this. The one who met Elena at 26 and spent the better part of 2 decades never once having to examine what kind of lover he actually was. Because Elena had simply never given him reason to wonder. David, if you'd asked him to describe his own attachment style before Elena's illness, would have said he didn't have one, that the whole framework sounded like something for people with more complicated childhoods than his, and his parents had stayed married. Nobody had left. Dinner was on the table every night at 6. By the standard David had always used to measure these things, he'd had an easy, uneventful upbringing, nothing to untangle. And what he hadn't fully reckoned with until Elena's illness forced the question was that his parents' steadiness had come with its own quiet cost. A house where feelings were managed rather than spoken, where his mother's occasional bad days were met with a cheerful, slightly too fast pivot toward normalcy, and where David had learned early and thoroughly that the fastest way to make an uncomfortable feeling disappear was to not look at it directly. He didn't grow up anxious. He didn't grow up avoidant, exactly. No. He grew up fluent in a third strategy nobody had bothered to name for him. Keep everything moving forward. Don't stop to examine the hard parts, and the hard parts will eventually resolve themselves the way weather does. That strategy had worked, more or less, for 18 years of an easy marriage. It had never been tested because nothing had ever required David to sit still inside a feeling long enough to actually feel the whole shape of it. Now, Elena's illness was the first thing in his adult life that refused to resolve itself like weather. It sat there. It didn't move on a schedule David could manage his way around. And for the first several months, David's instinct, the same instinct that had carried him smoothly through nearly 2 decades of marriage, was to try to fix his way through it. He researched every treatment option obsessively, late into the night, long after Elena had gone to sleep. Not because the research was especially useful at that stage, but because researching felt like doing something, and doing something felt like the only alternative to sitting still inside the fear. It was Elena, in fact, in one of her clearer weeks early in the recovery, who first named what David was doing. "You don't have to fix this tonight," she told him. And finding him at 2:0 in the morning, with 4 browser tabs open on treatment protocols he didn't have the medical background to properly evaluate. "You can just sit here with me instead. You don't have to be doing something every single second." David remembers that sentence landing somewhere strange in his chest. Not comforting exactly, not at first. Something closer to being caught. And because Elena had just described, without knowing the clinical term for it, the exact thing David had spent his whole life doing instead of feeling, staying busy enough that he never had to sit still inside something hard, and learning to simply sit, to be present without producing anything, without managing, without moving the conversation toward a solution, turned out to be one of the harder skills David had ever had to build as an adult. He wasn't good at it in month 2. He was better at it marginally by month 6. By month 12, sitting quietly beside Elena while she read, saying nothing for 20 minutes at a stretch, had gone from something that made his skin crawl to something that, on good days, felt almost like a form of prayer. This is worth naming plainly, because it's easy to hear David's story and assume he simply had a naturally steady, trusting temperament that made all of this easier for him than it would be for most people. He didn't. David's steadiness during Elena's recovery wasn't a trait he was born with. It was a skill he was building clumsily, real-time, the exact same way every person in this story has had to build theirs, by noticing the old reflex and choosing, deliberately, imperfectly, again and again to do something different with it. And you felt some version of this, even if your particular underworld looked nothing like a hospital hallway. Maybe it was a partner who went quiet after an argument, and you spent the silence constructing an entire imagined future where they'd already decided to leave. Maybe it was a friendship that faded, and instead of asking what happened, you simply assumed you already knew that you weren't wanted anymore, that the silence was the answer. Human beings are, it turns out, remarkably bad at tolerating a gap in information about the people we love. And we would rather fill that gap with a story, even a devastating one, than sit inside the discomfort of simply not knowing. There's a name for why some of us do this more than others, and it goes back much further than any hospital hallway. It goes back to the very first relationship most of us ever have. In the 1950s and 60s, a developmental psychologist named Mary Ainsworth, building on the earlier work of a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby, ran a now famous set of experiments with toddlers and their mothers. Psychologists still call it the strange situation. Mother and her small child would be brought into an unfamiliar room. The mother would leave briefly, then she'd return, and researchers would watch closely what the child did in those few minutes of separation and reunion. Some children were upset when the mother left, but calmed quickly and happily once she came back, reaching for her, being comforted, then returning to play. Psychologists called this secure attachment, and other children barely reacted when the mother left and seemed almost indifferent when she returned. Even though their heart rates, measured separately, showed they were just as distressed as everyone else. They had simply learned, somewhere along the way, that showing the distress didn't get their needs met, so they'd stopped showing it. That pattern became known as avoidant attachment. And a third group of children became inconsolable when the mother left, and strangely seemed almost angry when she returned, clinging to her one moment, pushing her away the next, unable to fully accept the comfort, even though they desperately wanted it. That pattern is called anxious attachment. And here's the part that matters for the rest of this story. Those patterns formed before most of us have a single memory we can consciously access, don't stay in the nursery. They follow us, and into every close relationship we ever build for the rest of our lives, including the one you might be in right now. This isn't something you were born with exactly. It's closer to a map, an emotional map drawn by the first people who ever loved you, or failed to, about what love is generally like, and what you can expect from it. And most of us are still using that same map decades later without ever having checked whether it's accurate anymore. Which brings us to Sarah. Sarah was 42 years old, and from the outside her life looked like the kind of thing people say they want. Steady marriage of 18 years, 2 kids 17 and 14 both doing well in school, a house with a garden, she'd built herself one flower bed at a time over a decade of Saturday mornings. If you met Sarah at a dinner party, she would tell you with what sounded like total sincerity that she had no regrets. But there's one more thing about Sarah, and it's the thing she never said out loud at dinner parties. Late at night, after everyone else in the house was asleep, Sarah would sometimes sit alone in the kitchen, with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and she would think about a version of herself that never got to exist. The Sarah who wanted at 23 to spend a year backpacking through South America before settling down. The Sarah who had once briefly considered a career in architecture before deciding it was too impractical for a young mother to pursue. She had given those versions of herself up, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, the way a person gives up almost everything important, one reasonable, loving, quietly self-erasing decision at a time. Sarah's husband was not a villain in this story. He never asked her to give anything up. That's actually what made it harder for Sarah to name what she was feeling, even to herself. There was no one to be angry at. There was just this slow, persistent ache, a grief for a life she'd never technically lost because she'd never technically had it. This is the part no school ever teaches you. Grief doesn't only show up when something is taken from you. And sometimes it shows up for the things you gave away willingly, one small yes at a time, until one day you look up and the person you used to imagine becoming is simply gone. And there's no funeral for that kind of loss, no casserole delivered to your door, no one who understands why you're crying over a life that was never real to begin with. Sarah's husband loved her. That was never the question. The question Sarah eventually had to ask herself in therapy at 42 was whether she had ever fully told him what loving her back would have required, whether she had handed him her whole self to love, or a carefully managed, endlessly accommodating version of herself that she'd built specifically so she'd never have to ask him for anything and risk hearing no. Hold on to that thought because it's going to matter again later. For now, we need to go meet two more people, Anna and James, because their relationship shows what happens when Sarah's kind of quiet self-erasure meets its opposite in the same room, in the same marriage. And Anna was 29 when she met James. She would later describe it, only half joking, as falling for him the way you fall down a staircase, fast, disorienting, and with a distinct sense that she hadn't chosen to go down exactly, so much as lost her footing and been unable to stop. Anna had grown up the anxious way. Her father had left when she was 6, and her mother, overwhelmed and grieving her own marriage, had been present but unpredictable, sometimes warm and attentive, sometimes distracted for days at a time by her own pain. Anna learned early that love could disappear without warning, that the only way to keep it close was to stay alert to every small sign that it might be leaving again. James had grown up differently, but arrived at a strangely similar place. His household had been calm on the surface and cold underneath. A family that didn't yell, didn't fight, and also didn't hug, didn't say "I love you" out loud, didn't ask each other how anyone was really doing. James learned, just as early as Anna had, that needing anything from another person was a kind of danger. Not because love had been ripped away from him the way it had from Anna, not because it had simply never been offered freely enough to seem safe to reach for. So James built a different strategy. He didn't chase reassurance the way Anna did. He didn't need to check, to confirm, ask "Are we okay" 4 times in one evening. He handled the same underlying fear by doing the opposite. He pulled back the moment things got close, gave himself an exit before anyone could use one on him first. And you can probably already see where this is going. And if you've ever loved someone or been loved by someone whose instincts ran the opposite direction from your own, you already know how this story usually goes. And the more Anna felt uncertain, the more she reached for James. A text asking where he was, a question about whether he still found her attractive, a need to talk through a small disagreement immediately rather than let it sit. And the more Anna reached, the more James felt something in his chest tighten, an old alarm bell from childhood ringing that said, "This is exactly the kind of demand that means someone is about to be disappointed in you, so create some distance." He'd go quiet. He'd need space. He'd take longer to answer his phone, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of self-protective instinct so old he barely noticed himself doing it. And the more James pulled away, the more Anna's original fear, the one first written into her at 6 years old, watching her father's car pull out of the driveway for the last time, felt confirmed. See, her nervous system whispered, this is what happens. This is always what happens. Psychologists sometimes call this the anxious avoidant trap, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the single most common and most painful patterns in modern relationships. Neither person is doing anything wrong, exactly. Both people are simply running the oldest program they have, the one installed decades before either of them had any say in the matter. Anna reaching harder, James pulling further away, each one's coping mechanism triggering the other's deepest fear in an endless, exhausting loop that neither of them chose, and neither of them at first knew how to name. Here's what changed everything for Anna and James, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the first real turning point in this whole story. It wasn't a single dramatic conversation. It was smaller than that and slower. In couples counseling, both of them, separately and then together, started to understand that the behavior driving them crazy in the other person wasn't actually about the other person at all. Anna's need for constant reassurance wasn't really about whether James loved her enough today. It was a 6-year-old girl still living somewhere inside her, watching the driveway and waiting for a car that never came back. And James's need for distance wasn't really about whether he wanted Anna close. And it was a boy who had never once been taught that his needs were safe to voice, protecting himself the only way he knew how, by making sure he never needed anything from anyone he couldn't afford to lose. Once they could see the 6-year-old and the boy standing behind each of their worst arguments, something shifted. Not immediately, not perfectly, but for the first time, when Anna felt the old fear rising, she started being able to say out loud, I know this isn't really about tonight. I'm scared, and I need you to tell me you're not going anywhere. And for the first time, and James started being able to hear that, not as a demand that would eventually crush him, but as a small, frightened person asking for something reasonable and to give it to her instead of retreating. That's not the whole story of Anna and James. We're going to come back to them, because a pattern that old doesn't disappear in one good conversation. But it's the first pattern reveal of the night, and here it is plainly. Most of the fights you have with the person you love were not actually written by the two of you. They were written years before either of you met by people who are in some cases no longer even alive. And the moment you can see that old author standing behind your own worst moments, you get for the first time a real chance to write something different. Now, think back for a second. David sitting in his living room, watching his recovering wife go quiet for 20 minutes, feeling that same animal fear rise in his chest. Remember what the doctor told him. She needs to feel safe, not managed, not monitored. David, it turns out, had spent most of his adult life without ever needing to examine his own attachment style, because his marriage before Elena's illness had simply never asked it of him. Elena had always been steady, easy to read, generous with reassurance without being asked. David had never had to sit inside uncertainty about her, not really, not for 18s. And now, for the first time in his adult life, he was being asked to love someone through a long silence, a long stretch of not knowing without demanding, that she perform her love for him, just to settle his nerves. David wasn't fighting monsters or gods. He was fighting the same fear Orpheus fought, just spread across months instead of one staircase. David didn't know it yet, but he had already started his own climb up the same staircase Orpheus was standing on. He just had a much longer way to go, and unlike Orpheus, he didn't have one single test at the very end. He had 18 months of small tests. Every quiet evening, every unanswered question, every moment when the easiest thing in the world would have been to turn around and ask her one more time, "Are you still there? Are you still mine? Are you still healing?" He was going to have to learn to walk without looking back one Thursday evening at a time. We're going to leave David there for now, in that living room, learning to sit inside silence without filling it with fear, because there's a much larger, much more dangerous version of this same lesson, waiting in the next part of this story. It's the version where trust isn't just tested by silence. It's the version where trust gets broken outright on purpose by someone who was supposed to protect it. Stay with me here, because what happens next is the part almost nobody wants to admit is true about their own worst moments. The reasons we betray the people we love are almost never the reasons we tell ourselves at 2:00 in the morning, lying to explain it away. Ryan was 35 years old, married 7 years, father of a 2-year-old daughter he adored so completely it sometimes frightened him, and by every external measure, man with nothing to complain about. Good job, healthy marriage, or what looked like one from the outside. A wife, Jenna, who had never once given him a reason to doubt her. And yet, 8 months before he sat across from a marriage counselor and confessed what he'd done, Ryan had started an affair with a woman he'd met at a work conference. A woman he didn't love, didn't particularly even like all that much once the initial excitement wore off, and could not, when pressed, explain his way into wanting. "I don't understand it myself," he told the counselor in their 3rd session, his voice cracking in a way that surprised even him. It wasn't about her. It was never really about her at all. There's something worth naming plainly about infidelity that most people get wrong, because the popular version of this story is almost always too simple. We like to imagine affairs as stories about attraction, about someone younger or more exciting, or simply more desired than a spouse who's grown familiar over the years. Sometimes that's part of it, but therapists who specialize in this exact wound will tell you, again and again, that the real story is usually stranger and sadder than that. Ryan wasn't chasing Jenna's replacement. He was chasing a feeling, the feeling of being seen as someone new, someone without a history of small disappointments, someone who hadn't yet had the chance to be disappointed in him. 2 years into fatherhood, exhausted, quietly convinced he was failing both as a husband and a dad in ways he couldn't name, Ryan had gone looking for a version of himself that didn't yet feel like a failure. He just happened to go looking for it in the worst possible place. Ryan can trace now, with the clarity that only comes after the damage is done, the exact shape of the months leading up to it. His daughter had colic for the first 4 months of her life, and neither he nor Jenna slept more than 3 hours at a stretch for what felt at the time like an entire year. And he remembers standing in the nursery at 4 in the morning holding a screaming infant and thinking a thought he was deeply ashamed of even having, "I don't know how to do this. And I don't know how to tell anyone that without sounding like I don't love her." He never said that thought out loud, not to Jenna, who was exhausted in exactly the same way, and might have understood better than anyone alive, not to his own father, who called every Sunday and asked how fatherhood was treating him, and received every single time the answer, "Great, really great." Not to a single friend, colleague, or stranger. He carried the thought alone, and it calcified the way unspoken things do into something that felt less like a passing bad night and more like a permanent verdict on his own adequacy as a man. The woman at the conference wasn't looking for an affair either, as far as Ryan could tell. She simply asked him, over a conference hotel dinner that was supposed to be about a work project, how he was really doing, not performing fine doing, actually doing. And Ryan, 3 drinks in and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the flight, told her the truth, the whole unshaped, embarrassing truth about the nursery at 4:00 in the morning, and the thought he'd never said out loud. She listened. She didn't flinch. And in that specific, dangerous moment, Ryan mistook being truly listened to for being desired and mistook both of those things for love. That's the part I have to live with. Ryan said it wasn't really her I wanted. It was just being asked a real question by anyone and being allowed to answer it honestly for the first time in 2 years. I built an entire betrayal out of loneliness. I never once admitted to my own wife. This isn't an excuse. Ryan will tell you that himself today, 3 years later, still working to rebuild something he broke with his own hands. But understanding why doesn't excuse what happened. It just makes it possible to actually fix the thing that's broken, instead of pretending the problem was ever really about the other woman at all. And it points to something worth sitting with before we move on. The danger in a marriage is rarely the presence of temptation. It's the absence of a place inside the marriage itself where the truth is allowed to be spoken without fear of disappointing the person you love. Now, let's talk about Megan, because her story is the one on the other side of a wound, just like Ryan's. And it's worth sitting with how different betrayal looks depending on which side of it you're standing on. Megan had been married to her husband, Chris, not for 10 years when she found the messages. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. No torn open letter, no confrontation in a parking lot. It was a phone left unlocked on the kitchen counter on an ordinary Sunday morning. And a text notification that Megan wasn't even trying to see. And then, in the space of about 4 minutes, an entire decade of her life rearranging itself in her mind. The strangest part, Megan said later, wasn't even the anger, and it was how fast my whole memory started rewriting itself. Every good year I suddenly needed to go back and ask, was that real? Was any of it real? This is one of the cruelest and least talked about parts of betrayal. It doesn't just wound the present moment. It reaches backward and puts a question mark over years you'd already lived, already trusted, already filed away as solid ground. Megan didn't just have to grieve the marriage she thought she had going forward. She had to grieve the marriage she thought she'd already had, in the past tense, because she could no longer be sure which parts of it had been true. What almost nobody tells you about the weeks right after a discovery, like Megan's, is how physical it is. She lost 11 pounds in the first month without trying. She couldn't hold food down most mornings. She'd wake at exactly 3, every single night for nearly 6 weeks, her body apparently keeping its own clock of the exact hour her whole understanding of her life had come apart. Her doctor, when she finally went in, told her plainly that this was not unusual, that the body processes betrayal by an intimate partner in ways that overlap almost exactly with the biological signature of physical trauma: elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, a nervous system on a permanent, exhausting high alert, scanning for a threat that had already happened, and yet somehow still felt like it was happening every single hour of every single day. Megan and Chris are still married. That's not the ending everyone expects when they hear this story. It's worth saying plainly that staying was neither the automatically right choice nor the automatically wrong one. Every version of this story is valid, and plenty of people in Megan's position leave for entirely good reasons and rebuild lives every bit as whole as the one Megan eventually rebuilt with Chris. What made staying possible for Megan specifically wasn't a single apology. It was 18 months of Chris doing something almost nobody wants to hear about. Because it isn't romantic and it isn't quick, total, boring, exhausting transparency. Sharing his location, sharing his phone unprompted, without being asked. Answering the same questions patiently for the 40th time on nights when Megan needed to ask them again, without ever once making her feel like the asking itself was the problem. People think forgiveness is a moment, Megan said. It's not. It's more like paying off a debt. Every single day he didn't do it again was a small payment. It took about 2 years before I stopped keeping score without meaning to. Here's where the research becomes genuinely useful, not just interesting. For more than 40 years, a psychologist named John Gottman, working alongside his wife and research partner Julie Gottman, has studied thousands of couples, watching them argue, tracking their heart rates during conflict, and following up with them years later to see who stayed together and who didn't. Out of all that research, Gottman identified 4 specific communication patterns so reliably destructive to a relationship that he nicknamed them the 4 horsemen. Criticism, where you attack your partner's character instead of addressing a specific behavior. Contempt, which is criticism's much more dangerous cousin. Mockery, eye-rolling, a tone that communicates disgust rather than disagreement. Offensiveness, refusing to take any responsibility, and instead treating every complaint as an unfair attack. And stonewalling, shutting down completely, going silent, refusing to engage at all. Of the 4, Gottman found that contempt was the single most dangerous. Watching for it alone in a 15-minute conversation between 2 partners, he and his team could predict with roughly 91% accuracy whether that couple would eventually divorce. 91%. Sit with that for a second. Not from watching years of a marriage, from 15 minutes. And this is exactly what most couples fail to hear when that statistic gets repeated. It's not really about the fights themselves. Every couple fights. Every long relationship has conflict, disagreement, moments of frustration that spill out sideways. What Gottman's research actually reveals is something much more specific. It's not whether you fight. It's whether underneath the fight there's still respect. Contempt is what happens when respect has quietly, gradually died, and all that's left is 2 people who've started seeing each other as opponents instead of teammates. Ryan and Jenna, when they finally sat down together in counseling, had almost none of the 4 horsemen in their arguments, which is part of what made the affair so disorienting to both of them. There wasn't contempt in their marriage. There wasn't stonewalling. What there was, underneath the surface, was something quieter and harder to name. A slow drift. 2 people so focused on parenting and working and keeping the household running that neither of them had noticed how long it had been since they'd actually seen each other, really seen each other, the way you see a person you're falling in love with, rather than a person you're simply coordinating logistics with. We weren't fighting, Jenna said in one of their sessions. That's what nobody tells you can also kill a marriage. Not fighting, just drifting so slowly you don't notice until you're already somewhere else. Chris and Megan's marriage, by contrast, had actually shown early signs of 2 of the 4 horsemen in the years before the affair. Small, easy-to-miss moments of defensiveness whenever Megan raised a concern. A habit Chris had of half-listening while scrolling his phone that Megan had over time simply stopped mentioning, because mentioning it never seemed to change anything. In hindsight, both of them can now see those moments as warning signs they'd normalized rather than addressed. Not causes that excuse what Chris did, but a climate that made the eventual betrayal easier to fall into than it should have been in a marriage, where both partners felt fully heard. This is the first real pattern reveal of tonight's story, and it matters more than almost anything else we're going to tell you. The marriages that break rarely break the way people expect. It's not usually one enormous betrayal out of nowhere. It's 1,000 small moments of not quite showing up compounding over years, until one day someone goes looking for the feeling of being truly seen in a place they never should have looked. Or one day, someone simply looks across the table at the person they married and realizes they can't remember the last time either of them asked the other a real question. Which brings us finally to Diane. Diane was 55 years old and had been unhappily married for 30 of those years. Not abused, not neglected in any dramatic sense, just quietly, persistently unhappy. A marriage that had gone flat sometime in her early 30s and had simply never found its way back. For 3 decades, Diane had told herself and everyone who asked the exact same sentence, "I'm staying because of the kids." Diane can pinpoint almost to the week when the marriage went flat. It was the spring she turned 32, a few months after her second child was born, when her husband, Gary, got a promotion that meant longer hours and more travel. And Diane, exhausted and outnumbered by 2 children under 4, simply stopped asking him to come home earlier. Not because she didn't want him there, because asking every single time and watching him choose the job anyway had become its own small, repeated humiliation. And eventually, it was easier to stop asking than to keep being told no in 100 gentle, reasonable-sounding ways. "No, I didn't decide to give up on the marriage," Diane said. "That's the part people don't understand. There was no day I decided that. I just slowly stopped bringing things up, one at a time, until one day I looked around and realized I hadn't brought anything up in about a decade." Her kids, by the time Diane finally sat in a therapist's office at 55, were 31 and 28. Both grown, both well. Diane finally worked up the courage to ask them directly, told her something that broke her heart in a completely different way than she expected. "Mom," her daughter said, "we always knew you weren't happy. Watching you stay like that, it didn't make us feel safe. It made us scared of what marriage even was." Her son, when she asked him separately, said something that stayed with Diane even longer. "No, I used to think love just eventually turns into that, 2 people being polite roommates. I dated someone for 3 years and broke up with her because it felt too easy, too warm, and some part of me thought that meant it wasn't real." It's worth pausing on what people usually get wrong about staying for the kids. It comes from a place of real love. Nobody doubts that, but research on children raised in high conflict or emotionally distant homes consistently shows something uncomfortable. Kids are far more perceptive than parents like to believe. They don't just watch what happens in a marriage. They absorb it quietly as their first working model of what love is supposed to look like. The exact same attachment style lesson we talked about with Anna and James being written into a new generation in real time. Diane staying wasn't protecting her children from pain. It was teaching them without meaning to that love is something you endure rather than something you actually get to want. This is not a story about villains. Diane's husband was not cruel. Diane herself was not weak or foolish, or any of the words she'd used against herself for 30 years in the privacy of her own head. Diane was simply afraid of change, of being alone at 55, of admitting that 30 years of her life had been built on a foundation she'd never fully looked at closely. Fear dressed up as sacrifice can look almost exactly like love from the outside. It takes a long time, sometimes decades, to learn to tell the difference. Diane eventually left. It took her another 2 years after that conversation with her daughter, 2 years of therapy, of financial planning, of slowly building the courage to walk into an underworld of her own choosing, rather than staying frozen in one she'd been avoiding for 30 years. She'll tell you now at 58 that leaving was the hardest and most frightening thing she has ever done. She'll also tell you it's the first time in 3 decades she's recognized her own reflection. There's one more thing worth saying here before we move on, and because it ties Ryan, Megan, and Diane together in a way that isn't obvious at first. All 3 of them, in completely different ways, were dealing with the exact same underlying problem. A gap between the life they were actually living and the truth they were too afraid to say out loud. Ryan couldn't say, "I feel like I'm failing, and I don't know how to ask for help." Megan couldn't have known because the gap wasn't hers. It belonged entirely to her husband, and she paid the price for a silence she never chose. Diane couldn't say for 30 years, "I am not happy, and I am terrified of what admitting that might cost me." Silence, it turns out, is almost never neutral. It's rarely just an absence of words. Underneath almost every silence in this chapter, there was something enormous not being said, and in every single case, and the not saying cost far more in the end than the saying ever would have. Now, this is easy to miss, but it's exactly the lesson Orpheus is going to learn at the top of that staircase in the worst possible way. And silence isn't proof of anything. It's just silence. What you choose to believe about it, what story you tell yourself in the gap, is entirely up to you, and the story you choose can either carry you the rest of the way to daylight, or it can be the exact thing that costs you everything. Before we go further, if any part of tonight's story is landing somewhere real for you, if you've recognized yourself in Ryan's exhaustion, or Megan's shattered trust, or Diane's 30 years of quiet fear, I want you to do one small thing. Not for me, for yourself. Take 30 seconds right now and write down one sentence you've been afraid to say out loud to someone you love. You don't have to send it. You don't even have to show anyone. Just write it down and notice how it feels to finally let it exist somewhere outside your own head. And if this story is doing something for you tonight, hit subscribe, because we've got a lot more staircase left to climb together, and I don't want you to lose your place in the dark. All right, let's keep going, because it's time to go somewhere even harder than an affair, or 30 years of quiet unhappiness. It's time to go to the place where love doesn't get betrayed at all, where love does everything right and loses the person anyway. It's time to meet Michelle, whose husband is dying slowly enough that she has to learn how to grieve him, while he is still technically sitting across the table from her every single night. Michelle was 48 years old, and for the last 14 months, she had been doing something almost nobody prepares you for, grieving her husband while he was still alive. His name was Paul. They had been married for 22 years, and 14 months ago, a doctor had used the word terminal in a sentence about him in the same flat, careful tone doctors seem trained to use for sentences that will end a person's entire understanding of the future. Not next week, not next month even, but a horizon that was for the first time in their marriage visible, a distance you could measure if you let yourself in a way that most married couples never have to. People keep telling me to cherish the time we have left, Michelle said, sitting in a support group for spouses of terminally ill partners, her voice flat with an exhaustion that went beyond sleep. And I want to, I do, but some days I look at him across the breakfast table, and I'm already grieving him, even though he's right there, pouring his coffee, complaining about the news like he always does. I don't know how to hold both of those things at once, loving him completely and losing him slowly at the exact same time. Michelle remembers the exact moment the two feelings first collided inside her, because it embarrassed her enough that she still thinks about it. Paul had asked her on an ordinary Tuesday to pick up a particular brand of decaf coffee he liked, and Michelle had snapped at him, actually snapped sharper than she meant to, like, "You have 100 things you could ask me for, and you're asking about coffee," and then had to leave the room and cry in the garage for 10 minutes. Because the honest truth underneath the snapping was that some small, terrified part of her had started keeping a private, silent inventory of Paul's remaining ordinary requests, and she couldn't stand how mundane the ending was going to look from the inside. You'd think when someone you love is dying, every conversation becomes profound, she said. It doesn't. Most of it is still about coffee and whose turn it is to walk the dog, and did you remember to call the insurance company? And somehow that's the part that breaks you, not the big scary conversations, nor the ordinary ones you suddenly can't stand having a limited number of. There's a term for what Michelle is living through, coined by a researcher named Pauline Boss, who has spent decades studying grief that doesn't follow the normal script. She calls it ambiguous loss, a loss that lacks the clean final closure of an ordinary death, because the person is still physically present, still in some sense, still there, even as huge parts of the relationship as it used to exist are already gone. Boss's original research was actually about families of soldiers missing in action, and later at families of people with advanced dementia, people who are physically present and psychologically or eventually gone. But the pattern applies with devastating precision to Michelle's exact situation. A husband who is dying slowly enough that the woman who loves him has to somehow grieve and love him in the very same breath for over a year, without a funeral to eventually mark the end of it. And here's the part no school ever teaches you about grief. We're taught culturally that grief has a shape. Something happens, you cry, you have a funeral, people bring food for a few weeks, and then slowly you heal. But ambiguous loss doesn't follow that shape at all. There's no clear beginning to grieve from because the person hasn't actually died yet. There's no clear ending either, because you don't know exactly when the horizon you can already see will actually arrive. You're left holding love and loss simultaneously for months, sometimes years, with almost no cultural script for how to do that without losing your mind. Paul, for his part, was living his own version of the same impossible arithmetic. He told Michelle once late at night that the hardest part for him wasn't the fear of dying. It was watching her exhaust herself grieving him in advance, knowing there was nothing he could do to make that easier for her, except somehow to keep being as fully alive and present as he could manage, for as long as he had left, so that at least the time itself wasn't wasted, bracing for its own ending. Michelle's way of coping eventually was to stop waiting for permission to grieve until Paul was actually gone. She let herself cry sometimes quietly in the bathroom, not because anything new had happened that day, but because the ordinary weight of loving someone she was going to lose had simply built up past what she could hold. And then, and this is the part that matters most, she went back out to the kitchen and sat with him anyway, present in the time they did have, instead of spending all of it braced for the time they wouldn't. I stopped trying to protect myself from the pain of losing him, she said. Now, the second I stopped trying to protect myself, I actually had more room to love him. All that energy I'd spent bracing, I gave it back to him instead. They started in the months after that a small ritual neither of them had planned in advance. Every night after dinner, they'd each say one ordinary thing from the day they were grateful for. Not profound, not a grand statement about mortality, just small things. The coffee was good this morning. The dog finally learned to sit. You laughed at something on television, and I got to hear it. It sounds so small, Michelle said, but it turned out to be the thing that actually helped. Not the big conversations about death, the tiny, stupid, wonderful, ordinary things, said out loud on purpose before we ran out of days to say them. Now let's talk about Derek, not because his story shows what happens when a different kind of loss, not physical but emotional, gets passed down without anyone meaning to pass it down at all. Derek was 40 years old, married with 2 children, and by every measure a devoted father. He coached his son's baseball team, never missed a school event, worked hard to be present in a way his own father never had been. And yet, at 40, sitting across from a family therapist because his 12-year-old son had started pulling away from him, Derek made a discovery that stopped him cold. "My son told me," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that he doesn't think I really see him, that I show up to everything but I'm not really there." And I wanted to argue with him. And then I realized that's exactly what I used to think about my own father. And Derek's dad had also shown up to everything, every game, every recital, physically present in every photograph from Derek's childhood. But Derek's father had never once, in 18 years of living in the same house, told Derek he loved him. He never asked him a real question about how he was feeling. never offered anything beyond a nod and a good game after the whistle blew. And Derek had grown up telling himself that his father's presence was love enough because the alternative, admitting that something had been missing his entire childhood, was too painful to sit with. Derek remembers specifically the one time. As a teenager, he tried to close that gap himself. He was 16 and he'd had a terrible day. Cut from a team he'd wanted badly, humiliated in front of friends, and he came home and for the first and only time in his adolescence, tried to actually talk to his father about how he felt. His father listened for about 90 seconds, said, "You'll bounce back, that's life," and turned the television back up. And Derek never tried again, not because his father was cruel in the moment. The response was mild, almost gentle by most standards, but because the message underneath it was unmistakable. This isn't a house where those conversations go anywhere. And now, without meaning to, without even noticing he was doing it, Derek had built the exact same pattern with his own son, present in body, absent in the one thing that actually makes presence feel like love. Being truly seen, truly asked about, truly known. This is the part most people miss about generational patterns. And it's worth saying plainly on, because it's one of the most important ideas in this entire story. We don't usually repeat our parents' worst mistakes on purpose. We repeat them because we never got the chance to learn what the alternative even looks like. Derek wasn't a cold father because he didn't love his son. He was a cold father because nobody had ever shown him what warmth spoken out loud actually sounds like. There's a concept from emotionally focused therapy, developed by a psychologist named Sue Johnson, that's useful here. The attachment injury. It's the idea that certain wounds in a relationship, a moment when you reached for someone and they weren't there emotionally on when you needed them most, don't heal on their own with time. They calcify. They become the lens through which every future interaction gets filtered until someone consciously goes back and repairs the specific wound, rather than just accumulating more time on top of it. Derek's attachment injury happened decades before he ever became a father himself, on that 16-year-old's 90-second attempt that went nowhere. And without repair, it was quietly, invisibly, being handed down to a whole new person who hadn't even been born yet when the original wound occurred. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that Derek's story didn't end there. In therapy, he did something his own father never did. He sat his son down, and instead of defending himself, he said, "You're right. I've been here, but I haven't really been paying attention to you. Not the way you deserve. I want to change that. Will you help me figure out how?" His son, 12 years old, cried. Not because the conversation was sad, but because Derek said later, it might have been the first time in his son's entire life that an adult in his family had admitted to being wrong about something that mattered out loud without excuses. Derek also did one more thing, something his therapist suggested that felt at first almost too small to matter. He started asking his son one specific real question every single day, not how was school, which had become a reflex both of them had learned to answer with a single flat word, but something more particular. What's one thing that happened today that you're still thinking about? At first, his son gave one-word answers. After a few weeks, the answers got longer. After a few months, his son started asking Derek the same question back. This is the part most couples miss, and most parents miss too. Repair doesn't require perfection. It doesn't even require getting it right the first time. It just requires being willing to go back to the wound, name it honestly, and try again. That single conversation didn't fix 12 years of a pattern overnight, but it planted something that hadn't existed in that family for 2 generations. The idea that admitting you were wrong might actually bring people closer instead of pushing them away. Now, there's one more story in this chapter, and it's the one that's going to sit with us for a while, because it isn't finished yet. Frank was 60 years old when his wife, Linda, died. They had been married for 34 years, and in the strange, disorienting weeks after her funeral, the weeks when the casserole stopped coming and the house goes fully, permanently quiet, Frank found himself doing the thing almost every widow and widower eventually does. And he started going through her things, not to get rid of them, just to be near them a little longer in whatever way he still could. The first few weeks were, in Frank's words, administrative grief, funeral arrangements, phone calls to relatives, the slow bureaucratic unwinding of a shared life, bank accounts and insurance forms, and 100 small tasks that kept his hands busy enough that his mind didn't have to fully catch up to what had happened. It was only in week 5 when the phone calls finally slowed, and the house went quiet in a way it never had in 34 years that the real grief arrived. Not a wave, Frank said, but more like a change in barometric pressure, a weight that simply moved into the house and didn't leave. It was in one of Linda's books, an old paperback novel she'd read a dozen times. The spine cracked soft from use, that Frank found the letter. It was in Linda's handwriting, folded in thirds the way she folded everything, and on the outside in pen just 2 words. For Frank. It was dated exactly 1 week before she died. Frank didn't open it. He held it in his hands for a long time, sitting on the edge of their bed, and then he set it down on the nightstand. And he did not open it that night, or the next night, or the night after that. Weeks went by. The letter sat there, on the nightstand unopened while Frank slept beside it or tried to. I told myself I was too tired, Frank said later, that I'd open it when I was ready. But if I'm honest, I think some part of me knew that once I opened it, whatever was in there would be the last new thing Linda ever said to me. There would be nothing after that, no more surprises, no more of her left to discover. As long as it stayed closed, some part of her was still here. There's a term for a version of what Frank was doing, and it comes from the same field of research as ambiguous loss, and it's called protest behavior, a phrase originally used to describe how young children respond to separation from a caregiver, but which shows up, it turns out, in adult grief too. It's the instinct to resist, delay, or refuse the full reality of a loss. Not out of denial, exactly, but out of something closer to protection, an attempt to hold on to the last thread of connection for as long as it can possibly be held. An opened letter sat on Frank's nightstand for 3 weeks, and we're going to leave it there for now, unopened, the same way Frank left it. Because before we find out what it says and what it does to Frank when he finally reads it, there's something else you need to understand first about what it costs a person to hold a loss that hard for that long now, without letting themselves finally feel the whole weight of it. Stay with me here, because in the very next part of this story, we're going to go to the hardest place this story goes, the place where David comes closest to breaking, where Frank finally opens the letter, and where you're going to understand in your body, and not just your head, exactly what Orpheus was risking on that staircase. We are getting close now, closer than you think. We need to go back a moment to that 3 in the morning bedroom, David sitting beside Elena on her hardest night. We only gave you half of that story. There's a second half, and it belongs here, in the part where everything gets harder before it gets better, because that bad night, the one where David held Elena's hand and said almost nothing, was not actually the worst night of his 18 months. It was the second worst, and the worst one came 6 weeks later, and it's David still has trouble talking about even now. Elena had a second setback, smaller than the first medically speaking, but somehow harder to bear precisely because David had allowed himself to believe the worst was behind them. He had let his guard down. He had started quietly to imagine the 2 of them on the other side of this, planning a trip they'd talked about before she got sick, laughing again about something that had nothing to do with hospitals or physical therapy schedules. And then, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, Elena had a moment of confusion so total that for almost a full minute she looked at David, her husband of 19 years, and did not seem entirely certain who he was. David remembers the specific things he noticed in that minute because his mind, in the absence of anything useful to do, had catalogued them with a strange, hyper-alert precision. The particular way Elena's eyebrows drew together, not in recognition, but in the polite, careful confusion of someone meeting a stranger. The fact that she still said, "Thank you," when he handed her a glass of water. The same automatic courtesy she'd extend to anyone. The exact tone she'd use with a waiter. And how that ordinary politeness, stripped of the specific warmth she usually reserved only for him, was somehow more frightening than if she'd been afraid of him outright. It passed. The doctors again told him it was expected, that this kind of fluctuation was normal in a recovery this long, that it did not mean what his fear was telling him it meant. But David, alone in the bathroom that night, with the water running so Elena wouldn't hear him, cried in a way he hadn't cried since his own father's funeral 15 years earlier. "I kept thinking," David said months later, the one interview he agreed to give about all of this. "What if this is it? What if I climb this entire staircase, do everything right, don't look back once, and I get to the top and she's just not there anymore? Not really. What if I do everything the doctors tell me, and it doesn't matter, and I lose her anyway?" This is the exact fear that sits underneath almost every act of trust that has ever mattered. It's easy to trust when the outcome feels safe. The real test, the test Orpheus is facing on that staircase, the test David was facing in that bathroom, only happens when trusting doesn't guarantee anything at all, when you could do everything right and still lose the thing you're trying to protect. Here's what David didn't do that night, and it's worth naming clearly because it's the hinge the rest of his story turns on. He didn't wake Elena up. He didn't demand she reassure him, tell him she still loved him, prove to him in that moment that the last 18 months had been worth it. He let himself fall apart privately, in a locked bathroom, with the water running, and then he washed his face, and he went back to bed and he let her sleep. "I realized something in that bathroom," David said. "My fear was real. It wasn't crazy or dramatic or something I needed to just get over, but it was mine to carry. It wasn't hers to fix. The second I made my fear her job, I was going to lose the thing I was most afraid of losing just faster by my own hand, instead of by fate." He did, however, do one thing that night that he later came to see as important, not for Elena, but for himself. He called his brother, not to explain the whole situation, not even to fully articulate what had scared him, just to talk at 1:00 in the morning about nothing in particular for 20 minutes, until the tightness in his chest loosened enough that he could imagine sleeping on. "I think that's the part people miss about carrying something alone," David said. "It doesn't mean you can't ever tell anyone. It means you don't make the person you're afraid of losing responsible for holding you together. And there's a difference between reaching for support and reaching for reassurance. From the one place it isn't fair to ask for it. There's a piece of this part of the story David didn't fully understand until much later. And because for the first year of Elena's recovery, he'd been so consumed by his own fear that he hadn't fully grasped Elena was carrying a parallel fear of her own, one that in some ways was even heavier than his. Elena, the rare interview she agreed to give alongside David, described the specific terror of being the one who was recovering, the one everyone was watching, the one whose every mood and silence and bad afternoon was being quietly, anxiously monitored by the person she loved most. "There's a particular kind of loneliness," Elena said, "in being sick in a way that makes everyone around you afraid. And people started treating me like something fragile they were responsible for protecting, instead of a person they could still be honest with. And the thing nobody tells you is that being protected that carefully can feel a lot like being erased. Elena remembers a specific afternoon around month 9 when she snapped at David sharply out of nowhere over something trivial, the way Michelle had once snapped at Paul over a brand of coffee. She'd immediately felt guilty, watched David's face carefully manage its way into a patient, understanding expression, and something in her had wanted to scream, not at him, at the whole shape of what her life had become. A life where even her own anger had to be handled delicately, where she couldn't simply be irritated at her husband over something small without both of them silently filing it under symptom rather than simply feeling. "I didn't want to be handled," Elena said. "I wanted to still be allowed to just be a person. Difficult sometimes, wrong sometimes, not a patient, not a project. Just Elena having a bad day the way anyone's allowed to have a bad day." This became, in its own quiet way, as important a turning point in their marriage as any of David's private battles with his own fear. Around the 10-month mark, Elena told David directly what she'd been carrying, that his careful, patient, doctor-approved gentleness, while well-intentioned, had started to feel less like love and more like distance. A kind of managed politeness that kept her at arm's length, even as it kept her comfortable. David remembers being stunned by this. He had spent 10 months working so hard, not to burden her with his fear that he hadn't realized the effort itself. The visible carefulness of it had become its own kind of burden for her to carry. The burden of being protected so conscientiously that she could no longer be fully herself around the person she loved most. What changed after that conversation wasn't that David became less careful. It was that he became careful about something slightly different. Instead of managing his fear by managing Elena, smoothing every interaction, softening every disagreement, and treating her like glass, he started allowing small, ordinary friction back into the marriage. He let her be annoyed with him without immediately apologizing his way out of it. He argued with her gently about small things again, the way healthy couples do. Instead of letting every disagreement dissolve into careful, wounded silence out of fear that conflict might somehow set her recovery back. That was the actual turning point, Elena said. Not him being endlessly patient, him being willing to be normal with me again, to let me be a whole, difficult, real person instead of someone he was terrified of breaking. This adds something important to the lesson David was already learning about trust without proof. Trust, it turns out, isn't only about tolerating your own uncertainty without demanding reassurance. It's also about resisting the urge to overmanage the person you're afraid of losing. Because the more carefully you handle someone, the more you risk handling the actual person. Right out of the relationship, replacing her with a fragile idea of her that exists mostly in your own frightened mind. There's a researcher whose work is useful here, Bessel van der Kolk, who has spent decades studying how the body holds onto trauma and grief, not sometimes independent of what the conscious mind understands. Van der Kolk's research shows something that trips a lot of people up. Grief and fear don't just live in your thoughts. They live in your body, your chest, your stomach, tightness in your jaw at 3 in the morning. And that means you can intellectually understand that your fear isn't fair to place onto someone else, and still feel it as intensely as if it were. David's discipline that night wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear fully felt in his body that he chose not to act on. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth being honest about none, because the version of this lesson that gets flattened into a platitude, just trust more, just let go of your fear, isn't actually true, and it isn't actually helpful. You don't get to simply decide not to feel afraid. No, what you get to the only thing you ever really get to decide is what you do with the fear once it's already arrived. Now let's go back to Frank, and the letter that had been sitting on his nightstand for 3 weeks. And Frank's daughter, Amy, had noticed the letter on her second visit home, sitting exactly where it had been on her first visit 2 weeks earlier. And she hadn't said anything that first time, sensing her father needed to come to it on his own terms. But by the 3rd week, watching Frank grow visibly thinner, sleeping less, circling some private grief he wouldn't name, she decided silence wasn't helping either of them anymore. It was, in the end, not a dramatic decision that finally made Frank open it. It was something small and almost accidental. Amy came to visit, saw the letter still sitting there, and asked gently, "Dad, do you want me to read it with you? You don't have to be alone when you do." Frank said yes. They sat together on the edge of the bed where Frank had first found it, and Frank unfolded the paper with hands that were, he admitted later, shaking harder than they had at the funeral itself. And he read what his wife of 34 years had written to him 1 week before she died, when she'd already known, on some level, even if the doctors hadn't said it plainly yet, that her time was running out. The letter wasn't long. It didn't reveal a secret or a confession, or anything Frank had spent 3 weeks quietly dreading it might contain. It was instead a list, small, specific, almost mundane things. "Thank you for learning how I like my coffee, even though it took you 11 years. Thank you for never once in 34 years forgetting to check whether I locked the car door, even after I told you 100 times I always remember. Thank you for the way you used to hum off key doing the dishes without knowing I could hear you from the other room, and how much I loved you for something so small." Frank had spent 3 weeks afraid that the letter would be the last new thing Linda ever said to him, and that once he read it, there would be nothing left to discover. What he found instead was almost the opposite. The letter wasn't an ending. It was Linda telling him in her own handwriting that the entire 34 years, every small, ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday of it, had been the whole point all along. Not the anniversaries, not the big trips, the coffee, the car door, the humming she'd never mentioned hearing. Amy, reading over her father's shoulder, cried too. Oh, she tried at first to hide it, so she wouldn't add to Frank's weight. When Frank noticed, he reached over and took her hand, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. The two of them sitting in the quiet aftermath of 34 years of ordinary Tuesdays, being written down finally and read out loud. "I spent 3 weeks terrified of losing the last piece of her," Frank said, "and what she actually gave me in that letter was permission to stop waiting for some final dramatic proof that our marriage had mattered. She was telling me it already had every single ordinary day of it. And this is the part almost no one tells you about grief, and it's the resolution of the small thread we've been carrying since the last part. Sometimes what you're most afraid to open turns out to be the thing that finally lets you put something down." Frank had been carrying, without fully realizing it, a fear that his marriage had been ordinary, comfortable, familiar, lacking whatever unnamed spark he assumed other marriages had. The letter told him in Linda's own hand that ordinary had never been the failure he was afraid it was. Ordinary was the whole gift. Frank still keeps the letter. He reads it now maybe once a month, not out of grief anymore, but the way you'd revisit any of the truest things anyone ever said to you. He told Amy a year later that he'd started keeping a small notebook of his own, writing down most nights before bed one small ordinary thing about his day, the way Linda apparently had been doing in secret for years without him ever knowing. "I don't know who it's for," Frank said. "Maybe nobody. Maybe just so the ordinary things don't disappear without anybody noticing them the way I almost didn't notice hers." There's a concept worth naming here, drawn from grief research more broadly: the difference between what's sometimes called complicated grief, grief that gets stuck, that doesn't move, that a person circles for years without finding a way through, and grief that, while never fully finished, finds a way to keep moving, to fold the loss into an ongoing life rather than freezing around it. Frank's 3 weeks with the letter sitting closed on his nightstand sat right on the edge of complicated grief, a loss he was protecting himself from fully facing. Reading it with his daughter beside him was the moment grief started moving again. Before we go any further tonight, I want to ask you something the same way Amy asked her father. Is there something you've been avoiding? A conversation, a letter, a phone call, a truth you've been circling for months or years without letting yourself land on it. You don't have to do anything about it right this second, but notice it, name it, even just to yourself. Sometimes the entire distance between being stuck and being able to move again is just being willing to finally look directly at the thing you've been avoiding. And if tonight's story has been sitting with you the way it's been sitting with me writing it, I'd ask you to do one more thing. Leave a comment with the name of someone this story made you think of, not for the algorithm, because sometimes just typing a name is the first step toward finally reaching out to them. We're at the hardest part of the climb now. David in that bathroom with the water running, on the edge of the bed with a letter that took 3 weeks and 34 years to finally understand. It's about to get bigger than any one marriage, any one family, because in the next part of this story, we're going to zoom out and look at what 50 years of marriage does to two people who started out as strangers, and what happens to love when memory itself starts to fade. Walter and Margaret had been married for 50 years when Margaret's memory began slowly, and then not so slowly to fade. It started small, the way these things almost always do. Misplaced keys, a forgotten name at a family dinner, laughed off as a senior moment. But by the time Margaret was 73, the diagnosis had a name, and Walter, 75, found himself facing a version of marriage that nothing in the previous 49 years had prepared him for. Loving a woman who, on her hardest days, no longer fully knew who he was. The first time she looked at me and asked who I was, Walter said, sitting in the small kitchen where he and Margaret had eaten roughly 18,000 breakfasts together, I went into the other room, and I sat down on the floor, not the couch, the floor. I don't fully know why. I just needed to be as low to the ground as I could get. He stayed there for close to an hour, he says, doing nothing in particular, not crying exactly, just sitting in a stunned stillness he compared later to the feeling of having the air knocked out of you as a boy. That specific second where your body simply refuses to work the way it's supposed to. When he finally got up, he did something he still can't fully explain. He went to the hall closet, pulled out an old photo album from their wedding, and looked at every single picture slowly, one at a time, not as if he were trying to physically locate the 50 years that had for one terrible hour felt like they might have never happened at all. Here's what Walter did next, though, and it's the part of his story that has stayed with everyone who's ever heard it. He didn't stop showing up. He didn't try to force Margaret to remember him, didn't spend her good days quizzing her, testing her, needing her to prove that the marriage was still intact inside her mind. Instead, on the days she didn't know him, Walter did something almost nobody expects. He introduced himself. "Hello," he'd say, sitting down across from her at the kitchen table, gentle, unhurried, no trace of the grief underneath it showing on his face. "I'm Walter. I've heard you make wonderful pie. Would you tell me about it?" Not Margaret, who on those days had no memory of 50 years of marriage, no memory of their 3 children, no memory of the small apartment they'd started in, or the house they'd built a life inside, would light up, delighted by this kind stranger asking about her pie, and she would tell him the same story sometimes that she'd already told him 100 times over 50 years, and Walter would listen every time as if he were hearing it for the first time, because in the only way that mattered to her in that moment, he was. There's a particular afternoon Walter mentions more than any other. It was one of Margaret's good days, one of the increasingly rare stretches where the fog lifted almost entirely, and she looked at him across the same kitchen table, fully herself, fully present, and said, "I know I don't always know who you are anymore, but I want you to know that some part of me always feels safe with you, even the days I can't say why." Walter says that sentence is the one he holds on to, on the hardest days, the ones where introducing himself for the third time, in a single afternoon, starts to wear thin in a way he's not always proud of admitting. "People keep telling me I'm losing her," Walter said, "and some days I understand why they'd say that, but I've started to think about it differently. I'm not losing Margaret. I'm just getting to fall in love with her again, over and over, from scratch for the rest of my life. Some days that feels like the cruelest thing that's ever happened to me. Other days, I swear to you, it feels like the strangest gift. This is not a story about pickup lines or seduction technique. This is not a story about finding the one flawless, permanent version of love that never has to be rebuilt. It's a story about what happens when you understand, all the way down, that love was never a single thing you build once, and then simply maintain. It's something you choose and often re-choose, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, for as long as you're both still breathing. Now, let's go somewhere very different. Not a fading memory, but a marriage, under a pressure that comes from entirely outside the relationship itself. Carlos and Rosa had been married for 6 years, and from the very beginning, their marriage had a third and fourth and fifth voice in the room that neither of them had chosen, their extended families. Carlos's mother believed openly and often that Rosa didn't cook the way a wife should, and Rosa's father believed Carlos hadn't provided enough, hadn't achieved enough, wasn't quite the husband Rosa deserved. Every holiday, every family gathering became a small trial that Carlos and Rosa had to survive together. Whispered comments and pointed silences layered over every plate of food. For the first 3 years, Rosa said, "I thought the fights we were having were about us, about Carlos and me. It took me way too long to realize that almost every single fight we'd ever had started with something one of our parents said, and we were just finishing it for them in our own living room, without either of them even in the room." Rosa remembers one Thanksgiving in particular, the one she now calls, half joking, the worst dinner of her marriage. Carlos's mother had commented, in front of the entire extended family, that Rosa's turkey was interesting. A single word delivered with a small pointed smile that somehow contained an entire paragraph of judgment. Rosa said nothing at the table. She smiled, changed the subject, and got through the rest of dinner with the practiced composure of someone who had absorbed 1,000 small comments just like it. But in the car on the way home, the fight that erupted between her and Carlos had nothing to do with the turkey, and everything to do with 4 years of Rosa waiting for Carlos to say something, anything in the room, and Carlos not fully understanding. Not until that car ride that his silence in those moments had never once felt neutral to her. This is a pattern that shows up constantly in every culture, in every kind of family, though the specific shape of it varies. A couple stops fighting about their own actual disagreements and starts, without realizing it, fighting the battles their families of origin handed them. Old resentments, old expectations, old definitions of what a good marriage or a good spouse is supposed to look like, inherited and replayed rather than chosen. What finally changed things for Carlos and Rosa wasn't cutting either family off, and it wasn't caving to either family's demand. It was something smaller and harder. The two of them sitting down together and explicitly agreeing on what psychologists sometimes call a boundary of the couple. A shared understanding that whatever criticism came from outside the marriage, the two of them would decide, together privately, what to do with it, instead of letting it walk straight into their arguments unchallenged. The turning point, Carlos said, was the first time my mother criticized Rosa's cooking at dinner. And instead of staying quiet the way I always had, I said gently but clearly, "Mom, I love Rosa's cooking. This isn't up for discussion tonight." It was such a small sentence, but it was the first time in 6 years Rosa knew for certain which team I was actually on. His mother, Carlos says, was quiet for the rest of that particular dinner, visibly surprised. It took months and several more small, calm interventions like it before the comments slowed, never fully stopped. But something had shifted permanently in the room. The moment Carlos spoke out loud in front of everyone which team he was on. Here's the part most couples miss about outside pressure on a marriage. The danger was never really the criticism itself. Parents, in-laws, communities, they're going to have opinions always in every generation and every culture forever. And the actual danger is what happens inside the couple when that outside pressure goes unanswered. When one partner's silence in the moment, it matters. Most starts to feel like a vote against the marriage instead of a vote for it. Now, 2 more stories before we turn toward the research that ties all of this together. The first belongs to Priya and Marcus, married 4 years, and it starts with a number Priya found by accident on a Tuesday afternoon while looking for a tax document in Marcus's email. $22,000. Credit card debt Marcus had been quietly carrying and quietly hiding for nearly 2 years, making minimum payments from a card statement he'd arranged to have delivered digitally, so no paper version would ever land on the kitchen counter. Priya didn't scream when she found it. She said the anger came later, in waves, but that first hour was mostly a strange, disorienting numbness. "I wasn't even thinking about the money at first," Priya said. "I was thinking, who have I been sleeping next to for 2 years? Because it clearly wasn't the person I thought it was, or at least not the whole person." Marcus, when she confronted him that night, didn't try to minimize it. "I was ashamed," he said. "Every month I told myself I'd fix it before she found out, and every month I didn't, and the hiding got easier the longer it went on. Which is the part that scares me most looking back. Researchers who study money and marriage have a name for exactly this pattern: financial infidelity, the practice of hiding debt, spending, or accounts from a partner in ways that mirror the secrecy of an affair, even when nothing romantic is involved. Surveys on the subject consistently find that a meaningful share of partnered adults admit to hiding some financial detail from a spouse, and that money remains one of the most common subjects couples fight about, precisely because so much of it happens in silence rather than out loud where it could actually be resolved. Here's the part most people get wrong about money secrets in a marriage. It's rarely about the number itself. Priya said she could have absorbed $22,000 of honest bad luck without much trouble. What she couldn't absorb right away was the 2 years of small, deliberate choices Marcus made to keep her from knowing, choices that had nothing to do with the debt, and everything to do with what he believed she'd think of him if she saw the whole picture. "He decided for both of us that I couldn't handle the truth," Priya said. "And that decision hurt worse than the debt did. What rebuilt things wasn't a single dramatic conversation. It was Marcus opening every account, every statement, every login, and handing Priya full visibility for as long as she needed it, not as a punishment, but as the only way to prove that the hiding was actually over. For the first few months I checked everything," Priya admitted. "Not because I thought he was still lying, but because I needed my own evidence, slowly rebuilt, one boring, transparent month at a time." Marcus, for his part, started seeing a therapist alone to understand why hiding had felt safer than asking for help. "I grew up in a house where money problems were something you solved silently and never mentioned at dinner," he said. "I didn't hide the debt from Priya because I didn't respect her. I hid it because silence was the only tool anyone ever taught me for handling something I was afraid of. 3 years later, Priya and Marcus review their finances together every single month, a habit that started as a recovery measure and slowly became just something they do, the same way some couples have a standing Sunday phone call with their parents. It's not romantic, Priya laughed, but neither is trust, most days. Trust is spreadsheets and receipts and answered questions. And eventually, you stop needing to check because you've checked enough times to believe it. The second belongs to Nicole, whose path looked nothing like Walter's 50 years or Carlos and Rosa's outside pressure, and everything like starting over from something that looked for a while like total collapse. Nicole was 40 years old and newly divorced when she found herself for the first time, since she was 22 entirely alone. No husband, 2 kids who split their time between 2 households, an identity that had been built for 18 years around being someone's wife, and had simply stopped existing overnight. The scariest part wasn't the loneliness, Nicole said. It was realizing I didn't actually know who I was outside of that marriage. I'd built my whole self around being half of something, and suddenly I was just me, whoever that was. The first few months, Nicole says, she found herself standing in grocery store aisles, unable to remember what she actually liked to eat, because for 18 years, she'd shopped almost exclusively around her husband's preferences and the kids' school lunches. It sounds like a small thing, she admits, but standing in front of a shelf of pasta sauce, genuinely unsure which jar was hers to want, became a strange small symbol for a much larger unraveling. How much of herself had quietly disappeared into a marriage without her ever noticing the disappearing? No, this is exactly where the research on resilience becomes genuinely useful, not just comforting. A grief researcher at Columbia University named George Bonanno has spent decades studying how people respond to loss, divorce, death, trauma of every kind. And one of his most important, most counterintuitive findings is this: most people are far more resilient than either they or the culture around them tend to expect. No, we often assume that severe loss requires years of visible struggle before healing can even begin. Bonanno's research shows that a majority of people who go through even devastating losses find their way to a stable, functioning, even genuinely happy life again far sooner than the popular narrative of grief suggests. Not because they didn't feel the loss deeply, but because human beings are, it turns out, built with more capacity to adapt and rebuild than most of us give ourselves credit for. Nicole didn't disappear into her grief for years. Within 18 months, slowly, she'd rebuilt something that looked less like her old life and more like an entirely new one. A small business she'd always wanted to start, a closer relationship with her kids than she'd had time for during the marriage, and, eventually, a version of herself she genuinely liked. The business was a small catering company, built around recipes she'd rediscovered, recipes that were actually her own favorites, not her ex-husband's. It started as a way to fill her evenings and slowly became something she was, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, quietly proud of on her own terms. "I'm not going to tell you divorce was a gift," Nicole said. "It wasn't. It was one of the worst things that ever happened to me. But I built something out of the wreckage that I don't think I would have found any other way. I found out I was more than half of something. I was a whole person the entire time. I'd just forgotten." There's a term for this kind of transformation, coined more recently in psychological research: post-traumatic growth. The idea that some people, after significant loss or trauma, don't just recover to where they were before. They grow beyond it, developing a deeper sense of meaning, stronger relationships, a clearer sense of their own priorities, precisely because the loss forced them to rebuild from the ground up. This isn't guaranteed, and it isn't something you can rush or force onto someone still deep in fresh grief. but it's real, and it's more common than most people realize. And it says something important about the whole shape of this story we've been telling you tonight. Loss, even devastating loss, is not always only loss. And sometimes it's also the ground a completely new kind of strength gets built on. There's one more piece of research worth bringing in here, because it puts everything in this part of the story into a single sweeping frame. For more than 80 years, researchers at Harvard have been running what's now called the Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies of human life ever conducted, following hundreds of people from young adulthood all the way into old age, tracking everything from their careers to their health to their relationships. And after 8 decades and multiple generations of researchers, the single clearest finding to come out of all that data is almost embarrassingly simple. The quality of a person's close relationships is the strongest predictor, more than wealth, more than fame, more than career success, of how happy and even how physically healthy that person will be by the end of their life. Not the number of relationships, the quality of them. The presence or absence of people you can be fully honest with, fully known by, fully trusted by all the way to the end. There's a related finding from Brené Brown's research on vulnerability worth adding here, because it explains something about why so many of the people in this story struggled for so long before finally changing course. Brown's research on shame and connection found, again and again, that the people who report the deepest sense of belonging and love in their lives are not the people who avoided vulnerability. They're the people who developed, often slowly and painfully, the courage to be seen exactly as they are, uncertain, imperfect, afraid, instead of only showing the polished, managed version of themselves they thought was safer to offer. Walter introducing himself to Margaret over and over, without any guarantee she'd ever fully know him again. Carlos speaking up at that dinner table, with his whole family watching. Nicole standing in a grocery aisle, admitting she didn't know what she liked anymore. Every one of them chose to be seen in a moment of genuine uncertainty, rather than retreat into whatever version of themselves felt safer to hide behind. This is not a story about finding the perfect person, or building a marriage that never breaks, or reaching some finish line where love finally becomes easy and effortless and safe. It is not a story about avoiding pain or loss or fear, because none of the people in this part of the story avoided any of those things. Walter didn't avoid the pain of Margaret forgetting him. Carlos and Rosa didn't avoid the discomfort of standing up to their own families. Nicole didn't avoid the terror of rebuilding a self from nothing. It is a story about what becomes possible on the other side of walking through those things honestly, instead of around them. Before we climb into the final part of tonight's story, I want to ask you to do something small. If tonight's story has made you think of someone whose relationship you admire, someone who's weathered something hard and come out the other side still choosing each other, send them a message. Just tell them you were thinking about them. You don't need a reason beyond that. We're almost at the top of the staircase now. It's time to go back to Orpheus, to that frozen half-second, his head still turning, and finally find out what happens when he completes the motion. And it's time to go back to David and Elena, and the choice that 18 months of walking blind through uncertainty was always building toward. Stay with me. This is the part the entire story has been climbing toward. Claire was 25 years old, and for as long as she could remember, she had told anyone who asked that she never wanted to get married. It wasn't a casual preference. It was closer to a conviction built brick by brick over 20 years of watching her parents' marriage. Not a dramatic, explosive marriage, but a long, slow war of cold silences and passive-aggressive comments delivered over dinner. Two people who had clearly stopped loving each other sometime around Claire's 10th birthday, and simply never left, staying instead for reasons Claire, even as a child, could sense, were more about fear than love. I used to lie in bed and listen to them not talking to each other, Claire said. The silence was somehow louder than fighting would have been. I decided pretty young that marriage was just a slow way of learning to hate someone you used to love. I wasn't going to sign up for that. There's a specific memory Claire returns to more than any other. She was 11 and she'd asked her mother, out of nowhere at the kitchen table, whether she and Dad still loved each other. Her mother had gone very still, put down her fork, and said, after a long pause, "That's a complicated question for grown-up, sweetheart." And Claire remembers thinking, even at 11, that a simple yes would have taken about 1 second to say, and her mother's inability to say it in under 10 had told her everything. Her mother thought she was too young to understand. Then, at 24, Claire met someone who made her question every conviction she'd built her whole adult identity around. The scariest part wasn't falling for him, she said. The scariest part was how much I wanted to let myself keep falling, because wanting it meant I had something to lose, and losing it or watching it turn into what my parents had, that felt like it would actually kill something in me. Here's the part most people miss about fear. Like Claire's, it isn't irrational. It's evidence-based, built from 20 years of careful, painful observation. The problem isn't that Claire's fear was wrong. The problem is that fear, left unexamined, doesn't just protect you from repeating your parents' mistakes. Left unchecked, it can just as easily prevent you from ever finding out whether a different outcome was possible at all. What finally moved Claire wasn't a single romantic gesture or a proposal or anything that belongs in the version of this story that gets turned into a movie. It was a conversation late one night there. She finally said the whole fear out loud to the man she was falling for. Not a version she'd cleaned up to sound less afraid, but the whole unedited thing. And including the part where she admitted she might sabotage the relationship before it had the chance to disappoint her, the way her parents' marriage had disappointed her for 2 decades. He didn't try to talk me out of being scared. And Claire said, he just said, I can't promise you it won't be hard sometimes. I can promise you, I'll tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable, instead of going quiet the way it sounds like your parents did. That was it. That was the whole thing that changed my mind. Not a promise that it would be easy. A promise that whatever happened we wouldn't disappear into silence. The way I grew up watching 2 people disappear into silence. Claire got married 8 months later, in a small backyard ceremony she says felt more like a promise between 2 people than a performance for anyone watching. She still gets scared sometimes in exactly the way you'd expect from 20 years of that particular evidence. She's noticed herself more than once starting to go quiet during a disagreement, the old family reflex kicking in before she can catch it. But she has a sentence now, one she and her husband built together in that late-night conversation that she reaches for on the hard days. We don't go quiet. Whatever it is, we say it out loud even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. She says it's become something close to a household rule, one they've both had to practice imperfectly again and again. Now, one more story before we climb the rest of the way to the top, and this one belongs to a man named Robert, because his story is about a very specific kind of silence, the kind that almost runs out of time before it finally breaks. Robert was 65 years old, and he had never, not once in his adult son's entire life, said the words "I love you" out loud to him. It wasn't that he didn't feel it. Robert loved his son with an intensity that, if you'd asked him privately, he might have described as the single largest force in his life. But Robert had grown up in a house where those words were never spoken either. A father who showed love when he showed it at all, through providing, through showing up, through the same silent, dutiful presence Derek's own father had offered earlier in this story. Robert had absorbed the lesson early and completely. Real men don't say it. They show it through work, through sacrifice. And the words themselves are somehow beside the point. His son, now 38, had spent much of his adult life quietly aching for 3 words his father had never once said, and had slowly, painfully stopped expecting to hear them at all. He remembers at around 25, finally giving up on hearing it, not in anger, but in the quiet, resigned way a person stops checking the mail for something that clearly isn't coming. He told his own wife once, "I know my dad loves me. I just wish one time in my life I could hear him say it instead of having to assume it." And Robert had a heart attack. It wasn't fatal, but lying in a hospital bed, tubes running into both arms, and staring at the ceiling of a room that smelled exactly like the room David had once sat in 18 months earlier, waiting for a doctor to say the word if instead of when. And Robert understood something with a clarity that 65 years of ordinary life had never quite forced on him before. He had possibly almost run out of time to say the one thing that had always mattered most and had never once said out loud. His son was sitting beside the bed, exhausted, frightened, holding his father's hand in a hospital room at 2:00 in the morning. The same hour, the same kind of silence, the same kind of fear David had sat inside with Elena, the same kind of fear Frank had carried across an unopened letter, the same fear every person in this entire story has had to walk through one way or another on their own version of that staircase. Robert opened his eyes, looked at his son, and said the 3 words he had swallowed for 38 years. His son, 38 years old, a grown man with children of his own, put his head down on the hospital bed next to his father's hand and cried the way you cry when something you'd quietly given up on finally arrives. "I kept thinking the whole drive to the hospital," Robert said later, once he'd recovered, "that if I died without saying it, my spent the rest of his life wondering if I ever really felt it at all." And the truth is, he shouldn't have had to wonder, not for one single day of his 38 years. That was never his job to guess at. It was my job to say. Robert didn't stop there either. In the months of recovery that followed, he made himself say it again, not just once, as if the hospital bed had used up his entire lifetime allotment of the words, but regularly, deliberately, at the end of phone calls, before his son left after a visit, until it stopped feeling like an emergency confession and started slowly to feel like an ordinary part of how they spoke to each other. The first few times felt like pulling teeth, Robert admitted. "It gets easier. I wish somebody had told me that 40 years ago. It actually gets easier. Here's the part that matters most, and it's worth sitting with before we go any further." Robert didn't wait because he didn't love his son enough. He waited because he'd inherited, without ever examining it, a silence that had been handed down to him the exact same way Derek's silence had been handed down, the exact same way so much of what breaks or almost breaks a family gets handed down, not through cruelty, but through a simple, devastating failure to ever question whether the inheritance was worth passing on. Now, we have arrived finally at the staircase. We left Orpheus hours ago in your listening time, frozen at the worst possible second of his entire life. His head had begun to turn an inch, testing the idea. Daylight was close enough to feel a change in the temperature of the air, and behind him he believed, though he could not be certain. No certainty was the one thing he had been explicitly told he could not have. Eurydice was climbing too, step for step, close enough to reach. "Let's finish it." Orpheus's head turned, not because he stopped loving her, not because he stopped wanting more than he had ever wanted anything, to walk out of that darkness with his wife beside him. He turned because in the last few steps before daylight, the silence behind him had become unbearable, in a way that no amount of love could override. He turned because he was, In the end, only a man gifted enough to move the dead to tears with a song, but not gifted enough to out-hope his own fear. Not in that one final, unbearable second when daylight was so close he could almost touch it, and the not knowing had stretched past whatever a human heart can carry. He turned all the way around, and for one impossible instant he saw her, Eurydice, right there, exactly where he had hoped she would be. Her face turning up toward his, with something that might have been relief, might have been love, might have been the beginning of a smile. And then the darkness took her back, not slowly, not with any mercy at all. She was simply gone, and pulled backward into the underworld the instant his eyes confirmed what his heart had refused to trust. Her last word, if the old stories are to be believed, not a scream, not a curse, but a single, soft goodbye, because she understood, even in that last unbearable second, that he hadn't turned out of malice. He had turned out of love so large it had finally outgrown his capacity to hold it without proof. Orpheus tried to go back down after her. Of course he did, but the underworld does not grant the same mercy twice. Charon would not row him across the river a second time. The gate stayed shut. Orpheus climbed the rest of that staircase alone, into daylight he no longer wanted, carrying nothing back with him but the sound of the goodbye he would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to forget. And sit with that ending for a moment, because we are not going to soften it for you. This isn't a story with a rescue at the last second. It's older and harder than that, and it has survived for thousands of years, precisely because it refuses to lie to you about what love actually costs when trust runs out one step too soon. Now let's go back one final time to David. We told you at the start of this story that David had been climbing a version of the same staircase for 18 months. A marriage, a recovery, a long, unbroken stretch of nights where the easiest thing in the world would have been to demand reassurance from a wife who had none left to give. We told you about the 3 Ave Neo in the morning bedroom. We told you about the bathroom with the water running. We didn't tell you yet how the story ends. We're telling you now. It was the 19th month. Elena by then made a recovery the doctors themselves called remarkable. Not fully back to who she'd been before exactly, because recovery like that rarely means going back to a precise, unchanged version of a person. It meant something else. A new version of Elena shaped by everything the last year and a half had put her through sitting across the kitchen table from David on an ordinary Thursday evening. And David, watching her read quietly, not saying anything for 20 minutes, felt something rise in his chest that he recognized instantly because he had felt it 100 times over the previous 18 months. The old fear, the old animal whisper that silence meant something was wrong, that he needed to check, to ask, to collect some small piece of proof that everything was still okay between them. He didn't turn around this time either, not because it had become effortless. It hadn't. Not fully, not ever, really. But because 18 months of practice had taught him something Orpheus never got the chance to learn. The fear doesn't go away. You don't graduate out of feeling it. What changes if you practice it enough times, in enough small ordinary Thursday evenings, is your relationship to the fear itself. You get better at recognizing it as a feeling passing through you, rather than a fact about the world you're required to act on immediately. So, David sat with it, let it rise, let it sit in his chest for a minute, 2 minutes, then, without any drama at all, let it pass. And Elena, after 20 minutes, looked up from her book, caught him watching her and smiled. The specific, easy smile David hadn't fully realized until that exact second he'd been afraid he might never see again. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," David said. "I'm just glad you're here." He didn't need her to say anything back. That was the whole point. The thing 18 months had finally taught him. He didn't need it confirmed. He already trusted it. Later that same evening, almost as an afterthought, Elena told him something he hadn't known until that moment, that she had in fact noticed. Not every instance maybe, but enough of them. The nights he'd sat quietly beside her instead of asking, the way he'd learned somewhere along the way to simply stay, instead of needing her to perform reassurance she didn't have. "I always knew you were scared," she said. "I just didn't know until we were mostly through it, how hard you were working not to let it become my job to fix. I want you to know I saw it, all of it." This is the modern bridge of tonight's story. And it's worth naming plainly, because it's the oldest fear the human species has ever carried, dressed up in 1,000 different modern costumes. The urge to check a phone one more time, the urge to reread a message searching for a hidden meaning that probably isn't there. The urge to ask, "Do you still love me?" one more time, even after you've already been told, because some old, frightened part of you doesn't fully believe that love can exist without being constantly reproven. It is the fear of losing what you cannot currently see, and it is, in one form or another, not standing behind nearly every act of self-sabotage anyone has ever committed against a relationship they actually wanted to keep. Orpheus lost Eurydice because he could not tolerate not knowing for one final, unbearable stretch of silence. David kept Elena, not in the sense of possessing her, but in the sense of staying present for the whole uncertain, unguaranteed shape of a real marriage, because 18 months of small, repeated practice had taught his nervous system something Orpheus never lived long enough to learn. That trust isn't a single heroic act performed once under maximum pressure at the top of a staircase. It's a muscle built in 1,000 small, unremarkable moments where nobody's watching and nothing dramatic is at stake, until the muscle is strong enough to hold even when the stakes finally do get high. If tonight's story has stirred something in you, a face that came to mind, a person you've been meaning to trust more or forgive, or simply stop needing to check on so constantly, I want you to do one last thing before we close. Man, find one small way today to practice staying present with someone you love without needing proof. Don't ask the reassuring question. Don't send the checking text. Just sit for a few minutes inside the not knowing. Notice that you survive it. That's the whole exercise. That's the entire staircase taken one single step at a time. We are almost at the top now. So, here we are at the top of the staircase. Daylight finally on our faces. Man, it's time to tell you the 3 things this whole night was actually trying to teach you. The first lesson is this: silence is never proof of anything. Not the silence of a partner who hasn't texted back in an hour. Not the silence of a marriage that's gone quiet after years of noise. Not even the total unbearable silence behind you on a staircase leading out of the underworld. Silence is simply the absence of information, and what you choose to fill that absence with, fear or trust, says far more about the story you're carrying inside you than it says about the person you love. David learned this the hard way one Thursday evening at a time, and Orpheus learned it too late in the space of a single turned head. The second lesson is this: the wounds we don't examine get handed down whether we mean to hand them down or not. Derek nearly gave his son the exact same silence his own father gave him. Robert almost let 38 years pass without ever saying words that cost him nothing but his own old fear to say. And every single person in tonight's story who broke a pattern, Sarah asking for what she wanted, Anna and James naming their fear out loud instead of acting it out, Diane finally walking into a future she'd been too afraid to choose, Claire refusing to let her parents' silence become own, broke it the same way by looking directly at where the pattern came from, instead of simply repeating it because it was the only shape love had ever taken in their hands. And the third lesson, the one that matters most, the one I want you to actually carry out of this video and into your own life tonight. Trust isn't something you either have or don't have. It isn't a personality trait, And it isn't a gift some people are lucky enough to be handed at birth. It's a practice. It's Frank finally opening a letter he was afraid would be the last thing his wife ever said to him, and discovering instead that it was permission to stop waiting for proof his marriage had mattered. It's Walter sitting down across from a woman who no longer remembers his name and falling in love with her all over again anyway. It's Michelle choosing to keep loving Paul in full instead of bracing herself against the loss in advance. It's a single sentence spoken in a hospital room at 2 in the morning. 38 years too late and exactly on time. Trust is built the same way a staircase is climbed, one step, one silence, one act of not turning around at a time. Think for a second about your own staircase. Maybe it isn't a marriage at all. Maybe it's a friendship that went quiet after a misunderstanding neither of you ever cleared up. Maybe it's a parent you haven't called in longer than you'd like to admit because the silence between you has gone on so long it's started to feel permanent, even though nothing about it actually is. Maybe it's simply the small ordinary fear that shows up in your own chest on an ordinary Thursday evening. The one that whispers you need proof right now that you are still loved. Every person in tonight's story was at some point standing exactly where you might be standing right now. None of them knew in the moment how their own staircase would end. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I really do mean for you to answer it in the comments right now while it's still sitting in your chest. Which part of tonight's story hit you the hardest? Was it Orpheus turning around one step too soon? Was it Frank and the letter? Was it Robert in that hospital bed finally saying the thing he'd swallowed for 38 years? Or was it something quieter, Sarah at her kitchen table or Nicole, standing in a grocery aisle relearning who he was? Tell me, sometimes just naming what you feel out loud to a stranger in a comment section is the first small unremarkable step towards saying it to the person who actually needs to hear it. Because here's the truth underneath everything we've told you tonight. Somewhere right now, close to you, there is a staircase. Maybe it's a marriage that's gone quiet. Maybe it's a parent you haven't told the truth to in years. Maybe it's simply the ordinary, unremarkable climb of loving someone else for one more day without asking them to prove one more time that they're still there. You don't need music powerful enough to move the dead. You don't need to bargain with anything underground. You just need to keep walking and trust that the person you love is still behind you, even when you can't see them, even when you can't hear them, even when every old frightened part of you is whispering that you need to turn around and check. Don't turn around. Just keep climbing toward the light and trust that love, given enough ordinary days, is stronger than the fear that tells you it isn't.